Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this session. It's really my pleasure to see you all here, and also thank you to our wonderful panelists that I will introduce in a moment. My name is Eliza Schmidt. I work for an NGO called Ground Truth Solutions. We're based in Vienna, and we do perception surveys with communities in humanitarian contexts who are facing the impacts of conflict and climate change on a daily basis. And the real aim of this event today is to make the case loud and clear that communities at the forefront of the climate crisis should be the ones to drive decisions and should also make decisions about where and how scarce climate resources should be utilized. Our speakers will frame a series of challenges that fragile and conflict-affected states are some of the most vulnerable to the climate crisis, but also receive the least amount of support. And that climate mobility represents an opportunity and not a threat if only climate migrants could help change the way that it is managed. And then we also want to hear from all of you on how we can best address these challenges. Oh, sorry, closer to the mic. How we can best address these challenges, closing the gap between what climate-affected communities need and priorities and how resources are spent to support them. Communities on the front lines have clear priorities and strategies for resilience and mobility, but their voices remain underrepresented in policy and financing decisions. It's something I've heard so frequently throughout COP this week of how important it is to really involve communities in this entire process and to really take their priorities into account. But what I've noticed is that we don't talk often enough about the communities living in areas also affected by conflict. In Ground Truth Solutions work, we hear constantly about how the aid people are receiving is not aligned to their priorities. In Bangladesh, for example, we hear too often that communities are receiving short-term assistance while their farmlands are being submerged by rising seas. In Somalia, we also heard about a lot of people about how they fear for the future of their livelihoods and want more people helping them against the worsening impacts of climate change. And in Chad, which is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, and is also one of the world's most underfunded crises, people are really worried about being stuck in cycles of aid dependency and really want more support and more investments in resilience and adaptation. It is my absolute great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Her Excellency Ms. Zara Abdi, who is the Director General of the National Center for Rural Development and Durable Solutions from the Federal Government of Somalia, who will open today's event by highlighting what is needed to support countries facing the systemic challenges of climate, conflict, and fragility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, to join this important session and to speak at a moment when the world is finally recognizing a truth that communities in fragile settings have known for decades. Climate change, conflict, and fragility are no longer separate crises. They are one interconnected system of risk that is shaping the lives of millions. Across the Horn of Africa and much of our continent, climate impacts are not theoretically future risks, they are lived experiences. They define whether families eat, whether children attend school, and whether communities stay together or are forced to move. In Somalia, climate change has become the strongest driver of displacement, stronger than conflict or insecurity. Over 90% of rural households in Somalia now cite drought and flood as the main reason they are forced to move. Climate shocks have reduced agricultural productivity, caused large-scale livestock deaths, and pushed pastoralists to move from frequently and further, often ending up in urban and pre-urban areas as IDPs. The last El Nino event in 2023 in Somalia was devastating, affecting 2.5 million people, displacing 1.1 million, and destroying livelihoods across 36 districts. Yet just before that, Somalia endured 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons, marking one of the most extended drought cycles in recorded history. For pastoralists, mobility was once an adaptive strategy, a source of resilience. Today it has become forced displacement, pushing families into informal settlements on the edges of our cities. Across the region, in Kenya, for example, lost 2.6 million livestock in the recent droughts. In Africa, 70% of internal displacement is now linked to climate impact. Climate impacts are interacting with conflict, poverty, weak government institutions, and demographic pressures, turning shocks into disasters and disasters into human crisis. This session captures a stark truth. Fragile and conflict-affected states receive just 5% of global per capita climate finance. Yet these are the countries where climate impacts are the strongest, displacement is rising fastest, adaptive capacity is the lowest, and the cost of inaction is the highest. This is a global failure, one that disproportionately affects African countries. Communities need long-term resilience and not short-term emergency aid. But the climate finance system today is slow, inaccessible, and risk-adverse. It's not designed for fragile contexts. It also needs to include displaced communities. Meanwhile, the cost of responding to crisis after crisis grows, trapping countries in perpetual cycles of emergency response. We cannot build resilience world while fragile states remain structurally excluded from the climate financing architecture. Despite immense challenges, Somalia is charting a bold new direction. We have integrated climate mobility into our national planning frameworks, such as the National Adaptation Plan, our updated National Determination Contribution NDC, the National Transformation Plan, and the National Solutions Pathway Action Plan, targeted to support 1 million IDPs to find durable solutions. All of these positions mobility as both a vulnerability and an adaptation strategy. Through our National Solutions Pathway Action Plan and the NTP and our upcoming Resilience and Rural Development Strategy, we are operationalizing these commitments by investing in cities and rural areas. We recognize this is a structural transformation challenge that must be managed by prioritizing climate resilience and rural development initiatives as the foundation for solutions. Our approach focuses on investing in vulnerable communities, residing IDP camps in urban cities and rural areas, expanding access to water, energy markets, skill development, and basic services, promoting climate-smart agriculture, livestock, value chains, and building conflict-sensitive resource governance. These measures strengthen rural resilience, restore livelihoods, and reduce forced displacement, bringing basic services and livelihoods closer to areas of origin to reduce displacement pressures. It emphasizes climate adaptation and rural development as dual objectives, building resilience where people live while enabling voluntary, safe, and dignified return for IDPs to the areas of origin. Yet, as noted in the session, community voices, especially women, youth, pastoralists, and displaced populations, remain underrepresented in climate planning and financing. This is a governance gap, it's a policy gap, but above all, it's a justice gap. Climate solutions cannot be sustainable if the people directly affected are not shaping them. Today, I want to outline 3 core commitments that the international community must make if we are serious about resilience. Number 1, increase climate finance to fragile and conflict-affected states substantially and predictably by removing barriers to access, simplifying application processes, expanding direct budgetary support, and creating dedicated climate financing windows for displacement. Fragile states must not be penalized for the very fragility they're trying to overcome. Number 2, invest early before households lose hope, before crisis escalates, and before people move. Every dollar invested in adaptation saves up to $7 in humanitarian response. Every water system we build reduces displacement and builds resilience. Every livelihood we strengthen reduces risk of conflict. Early investment is not climate action, it is peace building. Number 3, put communities at the center of design, delivery, and accountability through community feedback systems, engagement of youth and women in leadership roles, empowerment and resourcing of local authorities, integration of displacement and human mobility into climate planning, and ensuring shared governance of commons like rangelands and water points. Communities are not beneficiaries, they are co-creators of resilience. Africa has contributed the least to global emissions, yet bears the highest human cost. Supporting Africa and supporting fragile states is not generosity, it is fairness, it is stability, it is global risk reduction, and it is the foundation of just climate transition. Let COP30 be remembered as the moment we committed to bringing the most vulnerable into the center of global climate action, not as an afterthought, but as equal partners in building a resilient future for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a perfect introduction to the session, as we will be discussing everything that you mentioned in your keynote address, especially this need to really put communities at the center and to invest in resilience in conflict-affected states. I'd now like to invite our esteemed panelists to please take a seat at the front, please. We are joined today by Olga Petriak, the Director of Resilience Programs in Africa with Mercy Corps. We also have Perrine Pitton, who's the BRIC Chief of Party for NRC, Lauren Grant from the Beyond Climate Collaborative, and Dr. Harshita Umesh from VADA. Thank you. No. It's all good. It's all good. Oh. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really excited to hear all the different work that your organizations are doing. I'd like to start the conversation by introducing to you what the latest findings from Ground Truth Solutions work has been in the various contexts that we work in. So, like I mentioned in the introduction, we work in communities around the world who are impacted by both conflict and climate change, and they all tell us very similar things. The first thing they tell us is that there is a really significant gap between what they prioritize and the assistance that they're receiving. Everyone tells us about the urgent need to invest in resilience and to help people adapt to the impacts of climate change and to help reduce the risk of disasters. They tell us that without those investments, people will be trapped in short-term cycles of aid. And this fear of being trapped in aid dependency is something we see across contexts. People do not want to see repeated cycles of short-term emergency response. They want to rebuild, and they want to build their resilience to future crises. I want to share two examples of this. So last year we worked in Chad, which faced historic floods last year. Every single province of Chad was flooded last year. Almost 3/4 of the people that we spoke to in one of the regions felt unable to cope with worsening climate impacts, and they were very worried about the future. They also mentioned that their coping capacity had reduced over the last few years by a significant amount. So it's not only that they don't feel like they can cope now, but they are worried about being able to cope as well in the future. Chad is also a context that has seen funding decrease substantially, and people really voice this worry about being trapped in cycles of aid dependency and this focus on purely life-saving activities that do not take into account their needs for resilience investments. In Somalia last month, we also did one of our biggest surveys that we've ever done. We spoke to over 7,000 people across 11 regions about their perceptions of their resilience and what they felt they needed to adapt and thrive in a changing landscape. Just under half of the people we spoke to had been hit by a drought or a flood in the last 5 years, and half of the people we spoke to felt unable to cope with current levels of extreme weather. People overwhelmingly told us about wanting to escape aid dependency and want support pursuing their livelihoods despite challenges from conflict, displacement, and climate impacts. And this is something that was echoed as well in Chad. People want more assistance for their livelihoods, they want cash transfer, and they want this sharing of information on how they can adapt their practices. And this is just a real reflection on the urgent need for these resilience investments, and it would be really interesting to talk about some of the initiatives that are happening in these contexts to really make the case of how important it is to do this. So to begin, I'd like to start asking Olga from Mercy Corps to tell us a bit more about how important it is for these resilience investments to be made in these contexts. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elisa, and thank you also to our colleague from Somalia for those opening remarks. I think a lot has already been said, and maybe I'll start just by emphasizing a few points, is that First, communities in fragile and conflict-affected settings are really least responsible for this global climate crisis, but they are experiencing its effects every single day, right? This is not an abstract reality. It's a reality that every day exacerbates poverty, food insecurity, and in many contexts, conflict, right? When people experience forced mobility because they're dependent on a natural resource base that is increasingly degrading, they're forced to migrate into other spaces. That exacerbates inter-community conflict, but also there's a perception that in some cases the state is failing these communities, and that also exacerbates kind of conflict between citizens and state and starts to break down that social contract. And what I'll say is that in these contexts where you have cycles and years of climate and conflict crises, what's happening is exactly what Elisa pointed out, is communities are receiving assistance, but it's humanitarian assistance that's keeping them in these cycles of humanitarian need. So while they receive a lot of ODA, they're not really receiving funding that's allowing them to look into the future and adapt. And on the other hand, we know that climate finance, just 5% of it, as was mentioned, goes to these places. So really, communities are not receiving the type of assistance they need that's allowing not only to them move out of the current crisis, move out of these cycles of humanitarian need, but adapt towards the future. What I will say is that in the work that we're doing with communities, we're hearing something similar, is that they want assistance that is investing in their institutions, in their market systems, in natural resource governance. They want the systemic solutions that are going to bring about long-term change. And I think the good news is that we find that when we have the right kind of assistance, we have, flexible financing, fast financing, we're actually able to achieve tangible long-term results, even in the most fragile places, towards adaptation. And maybe I can give a couple of examples, first around institutional strengthening and what that looks like. So actually with FCDO-funded support in Mali and Niger, we work on the Justice and Stability Program, which is combining land governance, market-based interventions, and community-based conflict resolution. So it's bringing together communities, looking at their priorities, but also providing the capacity they need to resolve short-term disputes while also planning around land governance for the long term. So in this context, we work with local land commissions to help demarcate lands across farming and herding communities, bring them together around shared natural resource agreements, and those agreements are then verified and validated by national land and agricultural ministries and kind of become part of the national government systems, while those local land commissions are continuing to support their enforcement on the ground. In northern Kenya, another context where you see a lot of pastoral mobility, increased kind of patterns of drought cycles affecting communities. We're working with community-based institutions, helping them identify their priorities and then ensuring that they have representatives directly part of ward councils or formal government systems that are then embedding those local village priorities into ward and county development plans, which are then funded through national governments. Maybe I'll just share two examples, if it's all right, on the market system side, because I think this is a perception that, really we can't do markets work, we can't engage with the private sector in these very fragile contexts. In Northeast Nigeria, which we know is a context heavily affected by flooding, extreme weather, increased crop losses, as well as insurgencies, we've been able to work with communities in identifying market-driven livelihood priorities, really worked with hundreds of women's groups that represented tens of thousands of women who identified cowpea and millet as key opportunity crops they wanted to invest in. We supported them connecting to local seed enterprises and research centers to support access to climate resilient seeds, but then also worked with small and medium women-led enterprises across the value chain, packaging, processing, biofortification, repackaging, so these foods were affordable for local communities, really driving a very vibrant climate resilient food economy in a place that for years had just received humanitarian assistance. Similarly, I mean, just a final example, we work with refugee populations that, again, typically receive cash or other direct transfers on supporting them and supporting them with consumption smoothing, but then identifying enterprises that are market driven, and then around that supporting the enabling environment, working with market actors to ensure that they have ongoing access to inputs, that they have output markets that are not just propped up by the humanitarian architecture, as was brought up. So I think I just want to close with 4 quick takeaways. One is that it's really critical to drive systemic shifts that enable locally led adaptation. We need to drive community priorities, but those priorities need to be enabled by systems change. We can't just leave the burden on the local village without creating the broader enabling environment in markets and governance. I would also restate the case for value for money of these interventions. I think the opening remarks from Somalia made that case. But I would just say other studies show that for every dollar invested in resilience, between $2 and $13 are saved in humanitarian assistance. That was actually an FCDO study. In Ethiopia, we've seen these investments have maintained food security even through drought, while other places have dropped by 40%. And just to reiterate the point around, the financing needing to be fair, flexible, and fast, and to move away from the risk aversion of donors or doing things that feel safe, but that are really not going to help communities move forward in terms of their adaptation goals. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks as well for mentioning the critical importance as well as having the systems change, because this is also something that we see from communities. They understand how the architecture works, and that's what they're really calling for as well. So their messages are really for decision makers within that system. I'd now like to pass on to Perrine Pitton from NRC to talk us through other ways of investing in adaptation in fragile contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, and thanks to everyone. I work in Somalia, and I work closely with Zara Abdi and her Center for Rural Resilience and Durable Solution, and I'm going to talk from that context and from that perspective. Somalia is very vulnerable to climate change and is also a protracted humanitarian crisis. Obviously, a lot of internal displacement as well as refugees and migratory patterns. In 2022, 2023, we were again facing a long and very hard drought. And a lot of people in the humanitarian development, stabilization, government sector were looking at resilience actors like NRC and other NGO colleagues and asking us, okay, so what have you been doing? Because this is obviously not helping. And I felt very responsible. And it obviously our funding doesn't allow us to change the whole system of a country, but that had me think hard and really scratch my head with my colleagues about what is it that we're missing that might contribute to reducing the risk of these cyclic droughts and flooding, because unfortunately we also have flooding. So you imagine Somalia is very dry, but we also have really good rivers that are perennial. We also have flooding that happens every other year. So there is water. And then we're also funded by FCDO, and our colleagues from the climate team at FCDO were asking us, oh, but you don't only need to take care of the disasters of now and last year. You need to take care of the disasters of the future, those that are induced by climate change. So that's when I got depressed. And no, that's when I got a bit scared, to be honest, thinking about how can this be worse? And, are we trying to fight something that is like not solvable? And So don't worry, there's a positive turn to that story. Um, what I realized is that very often when we were analyzing the root causes of the crisis, we talked about degradation of ecosystem. We talked about the fact that rangeland are destroyed, but yet they're at the core of the Somali culture and economy. We talked about the fact that land tenure is very complicated for farmers, and that year after year the crops and the yields are reducing, the soil is eroding, the soil health is terrible, the biodiversity is also disappearing in terms of plants and insects and all of the bacteria that you need for a healthy soil. And that because we are always in that sort of short-term thinking and we want fast impact on food security, on nutrition, on access to water, we're overseeing that issue. We're just like, okay, the degraded ecosystem, that's not something I can take care of today. It's literally a problem for someone else another day. And we decided to embrace it, to embrace the natural capital and those and to also look at solutions that are fast, because it is true that you need a fast impact. You can't ask farmers or pastoralists that are at the point of destitution and at that tipping point of their resilience to wait for 5 more years before they have income or they have milk for their children. So you need a fast turnaround. And you also need to use the power of nature. Nature has the power to destroy, and we normally, in Somalia, it's all about natural disasters, but it also has the power to support human life, and it has for centuries in the drylands with a lifestyle that is adapted to the resources that are there. So we started looking at other places where restoration, nature-based solutions had taken place, had been successful, and a lot of nature-based solutions have been designed and fought for Asia and ecosystems that are more lush, more forest ecosystems, green ecosystems. So but we came to realize, no, it's also possible to restore soil health in the drylands, to restore these rangelands. And we started really investing in our own knowledge, in the community knowledge, in the government stakeholder also coming with us on that journey to learn how to restore the soil, how to bring back biodiversity, how to manage hydrology so that when it rains, we hold on to that water. It stays with us. It doesn't need to take the soil and run away with it. So doing earthwork, swells, bioswells, half moons, reintroducing seeds and grasses that had largely disappeared locally, supporting farmers as they conserve and keep and multiply the seeds. Even in IDP settlements, it's a little bit the same with displaced people. We consider they're at the end of the journey of poverty and destitution, and literally, except for cash transfers, there's not much that they can do. And again, it's not true, because during the drought, we engaged local women that had displaced and didn't really have farming skills, because most of them were more from a pastoralist background. And we told them, like, look, you think you have nothing, but actually around your shelter, you have maybe 6 meters square of soil. It's not the best soil, but it's soil. You think you don't have water, but actually, every time you cook, you have grey water. Every time you wash, you have grey water. Every time you pray, you have your ablution water. And then they started growing food and actually selling fresh and nutritious food to the city of Baidoa that had been out of fresh and green vegetable for 18 months already, because people will import staple food, but they are not going to import spinach during a drought, So, and all of a sudden they had dignity, they had food for their kids, they had an income selling and they were harvesting continuously, because this is a cycle of maybe 4 weeks of production. So all of these little things to say that nature can work in our favor. There are techniques that have been developed. They're adaptive, They deliver humanitarian benefits in the short term. They deliver co-benefits in terms of mitigating the risk of flood and the risk of drought by regulating hydrology, by sinking water into the ground, by growing trees that protect you from the drought and the high temperature. And they can also obviously contribute to this climate adaptation agenda that we're working on, but they also eventually store carbon and reduce, and can sink carbon in the soil. We need to think about our humanitarian and our fragile context with that mindset that we can meet different outcomes at once if we design it from the get-go with the right mindset. So that's my nature-based solution story. It is also something you need to do in partnership with the market actors, with the government, with communities, obviously. It is not something that will succeed by being delivered by NGO in isolation. It needs to be a movement, a replication, and it needs to be done at scale, which I think is doable because it's affordable. That is it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for pointing out the importance of changing mindsets, because this is also something that we see from communities themselves who say there needs to be a shift in mindset. We need to look at the nature-based solutions that are available in these communities in order to do two things at once. And I also really liked your point about needing it to be fast, because it's true that these needs are urgent. People cannot wait 5 years. And so there needs to be options in between to help build resilience over time. Thank you so much. I'd now like to pass on to Lauren Grant from the Beyond Climate Collaborative. Of course, climate change is bringing many challenges, including a lot of displacement. And so, yes, it'd be really interesting to hear as well about the work you're seeing and what is needed to transform climate migration from crisis to opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Olga and Pren and Harshita. Looking forward to your intervention as well. Everyone looks tired and it's very hot in here, so I'm going to try to be brief and hopefully we can all go do something lovely and rest and cool down. But thank you for being here and to the Resilience Hub for having us as well. Across fragile and conflict-affected regions, communities are doing so much more than just surviving crisis. They are transforming what resilience looks like. They are adapting, moving, rebuilding, and reimagining futures in the face of very compounding, overlapping challenges, as you all well know. And yet, too often, the systems meant to support them reduce the complexities that they experience to a set of risks to be managed. Mobility often becomes securitized. Displacement becomes depoliticized. Community knowledge turns into data points, not decision power. At Beyond Climate Collaborative, we start from a different premise, that mobility is not a failure, it is agency, adaptation, and a site for imagination, as well as transformation. Every person and every community has both the right to move and the right to remain. And realizing those rights is an essential part of climate justice. Today, places like Somalia, Sudan, Gaza, the Sahel, and the Pacific are too often written out of the future. They are described as too fragile to invest in, too complex to engage, too unstable to trust with power. But this is precisely where the moral and political stakes of the climate crisis are clearest. Fragility is not the absence of governance, it's the result of governance that has failed to center justice and care. So when we talk about closing the resilience gap, what we are really talking about is redistributing voice, resources, and responsibility. That means 3 key shifts that I'd like to briefly share. The first is going from inclusion to co-governance. Frontline communities must not just be consulted, they must co-author adaptation, migration, and peace-building strategies. Their governance systems aren't informal, they're alternative architectures of care and accountability that must be taken seriously and respected. Second, we need to go from crisis to capability. Migration, when supported by rights, planning, and resources, is a form of resilience. It sustains life with dignity and reshapes the boundaries of belonging, especially on a warming planet. And third, we need to shift from aid to accountability, as we've already been hearing. Climate finance must move beyond a charity logic to one of climate debt and global responsibility. This question is not how we help fragile states, but how we redress the structures that made them fragile in the first place. The challenge and opportunity before us is to see climate mobility not as a symptom of crisis, but as a site for transformation. Transformation in how we govern, how we allocate resources, and how we imagine justice across borders. So as I conclude, I just want to invite us to sit with a few questions. The first being, what would it take to design climate governance that starts with the rights, relationships, and responsibilities that frontline communities already practice? The second, how can we ensure that mobility or immobility, because many people don't move, becomes a matter of choice and not coercion, supporting people's agency to determine whether they wish to move or stay? And what would it look like to move from managing displacement to collectively shaping futures of mobility and care? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yes, I really hear your point about needing to really involve communities in the decision-making process, that this is a question of justice. This is as well something that we hear very often. People want to be able to make decisions about their lives. They want the flexibility of choice. They want to be able to make choices on how to adapt and whether to move or to stay. So that is also something we hear repeatedly and something that we need to support as well. And of course, one of the most important stakeholders when we talk about the future and adapting to the climate crisis is youth. Young people are critical to finding solutions for the future, especially in fragile states as well. And so I'd like to pass over to Dr. Harshita Umesh as well to share about how you see youth driving climate policy and programming in fragile states, and how can we amplify their impact?
Am I allowed to put on my doctor hat as well? So awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm a medical doctor, and I'm based in India, and I work in the fields of climate, gender, and health. But before I start off answering your question, I just want to talk for a minute about demilitarization, because a lot of this, when we talk about conflict or fragile settings or displaced communities, starts with the fact that these are some of the most heavily militarized regions in the world. And why is it so heavily militarized? It's so heavily militarized because of the assets that that country owns. Globally, 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions is from the military-industrial complex. And $2.7 trillion was what was invested. The Baku to Belém roadmap that was trying to scale climate finance to actually build into the loss and damage fund to pay back in reparations to the communities that have contributed the least to climate change said that they don't have enough funds because countries can't commit. And philanthropy said, okay, yeah, we will also step up. But the countries that have contributed the most, the global north countries, United States, UK, Europe, all these colonial and settler colonies, said that, hey, this is not our responsibility. So while we sit here, I would also like to take a moment to recognize all the lives that have been lost, from Somalia to Chad to Kashmir to every region in the world, Congo right now, that has lost their lives due to this military industrialized complex. I would also like to state that even though humanitarian response is mandated, that people who are driving the support on the ground, press, journalists covering this, as a doctor, I have seen so many lives that are lost, but I've also seen my colleagues who are so desperately trying to ensure that this aid is given to places, especially in like Gaza, not being allowed to enter and being targeted. That is a systemic failure on all of our agencies, especially proving how multilateral cooperation is so desperately needed. And the world right now needs nothing short of a revolution if we want to truly drive the agenda for climate peace and security, because it continues to be rooted in values that are colonial, extractive, and capitalist. To take one other step back before I answer your question, I'd like to say one thing. All of this, there's still certain people in these parts of the world that are living in privilege. There's still people who don't recognize their own privilege. But that privilege means that these people have the power not only in decision making, but have the power to access the resources that is a basic human asset and dignity, and such as water, food, and ensuring that that scarcity never reaches them. They're so ungrounded from what the realities are. Like, let's take Taylor Swift for an example. Everybody was raving about her concerts. And yes, maybe her music is so famous, but she did take a 4-minute plane ride across the state. Can anyone imagine doing something like that and how that actually contributes? And the fact that the people who have the voice, who are reaching billions and millions of people, are now speaking up about the climate, peace, and security agenda. We have to start getting uncomfortable, because if we're not uncomfortable, we're not going to shift our mindsets, we're not going to acknowledge our privilege, and we're not going to do anything to drive change. And I think that's what the youth are. We are unapologetic in asking for what we need. We are bold and we are loud and we are demanding change. We are at the forefront of this crisis, but we don't only see it as a crisis. We see it as an opportunity to build a world that is fair, just, and feminist for the future. Because we cannot continue on like this. And we need to center communities at this co-create. I love how you said co-creation, but I'd like to add in one more word to that: intergenerational. Because we do need flexible funding at these situations that come in, but not just flexible funding that comes in once when the disaster or humanitarian response is needed, but all throughout to rebuild, to be empowered, to actually have these as the leaders as they were. For so long, Africa, India, and all these other countries have been looted from. We weren't poor nations. We have become poor nations. We are now vulnerable communities. We have so much of resources and so much of expertise that we welcome people with open arms. It is time for the world to actually look at these countries as cradles of human development and to actually empower them to share in their resource and acknowledge what has been taken and give back in reparations immediately. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a powerful statement, and for reminding us all to remember the root causes of why we are where we are today, and also to make the point that there are so many solutions and there's so much agency in a lot of these communities, and it is our responsibility to work together in order to find sustainable solutions. So thank you. It's a great statement there. So thank you, amazing to everyone on the panel. I'd now like to invite Jared Howe from FCDO. Yes, please. Thank you so much. We've had really amazing interventions from all panelists here, talking about the root causes of the challenges we're facing today, and also some of the work that's being done in order to tackle these challenges. And it would be really great to hear what your reflections have been on the panel and how the UK the steps the UK is taking to act on some of these challenges. Thank you.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much indeed for having me here. And I had some remarks written down, and then as you all spoke across the panel, I changed them all, right? And it was just because it was such a great set of perspectives. And so let me just reflect on a few of those and pick out some things that I thought were really meaningful. Firstly, we talked about what resilience actually means, right? So everybody in this building and around is talking about resilience. And somebody said, sorry, forgive me, somebody said it's whether you feel able to cope. And it's really important just to remember that's what it means. Underneath all of this technical stuff, it's about whether people feel able to cope and how we support them to feel better able to cope. And I just think from a human point of view, it's worth remembering that. And I really like the focus, therefore, on capability in terms of how can people feel more capable to cope with what comes ahead for them. And I think that's a really important point. I think throughout all this, it's really important to ask ourselves whose risk is heard and understood, whose risk counts in this, and whose solutions count and whose choices count, right? And we should feel uncomfortable. We should feel discomfort. We absolutely should be pursuing a fair, just, and feminist future. Thank you very much indeed. I think that's exactly right. We've also heard, and it's easy to say, but this was tempered, that of course, I think in this room we would say communities are agents of their own resilience, right? But that's not enough just to say it. What we have to do is create the enabling factors that allow them to realize the form of resilience that they're choosing. And so this work is absolutely necessary. It is absolutely possible. Thank you, everybody here. And it must be intentional. We must learn as we do it. And Zara, in Somalia, you are showing that even in the most difficult context, leadership on resilience is possible. I was at a seminar earlier on where there were some data boffins looking at resilience indicators and indices across the world. And there are 5 main ones. And the only thing that unites them is in every single one of those 5, Somalia is in the top 3. So I think and yet you are showing the leadership that counts, and we're really, so thank you very much indeed. And I think the point that you made, Zara, is really worth making again, is that what we're dealing with here is interconnected systems of risk. And that's really hard, right? And that means you can't just do it in one particular place with one particular lever. And that's, again, why it's so important to start with the lived reality, as you said, of risk as it's understood, and work out from that, and then think about how markets and institutions and systems that shape them through co-governance can be improved. So I thought that was a really excellent panel. And then I wanted to say a few things, sort of reflecting on the panel that we're doing. And Zara, again, I'm afraid I'm going to steal your 3 points because they were also my 3 points, right? Because climate finance, putting people at the absolute center of it all, and early warning were 3 things I wanted to say. So on the climate finance gap, it is evidently true that there is a huge gap in terms of the need for adaptation and resilience in fragile conflict and affected states, and the extent to which climate finance is flowing into them. For the UK, we are lobbying across the piece with the World Bank and others, and the GCF to push those institutions to take on more risk, to start to finance differently, and to be able to reach some of those places, and to simplify access. That's a hugely important part of what we need to do. We have a program called Phenomenal, which is looking at climate risk across the Middle East and North Africa, and that is looking at nature-based solutions, Perrine, and clean energy pilots, so trying to build that in. It's looking at how we build early warning systems in refugee hostings in Jordan, and we actually know that if you look at the most vulnerable communities in the world, they're often in refugee displacement situations in terms of heat, access to water, facing violence and discrimination. Yet if you put that population together, it's a massive population, but it is largely underserved. We're also working on water governance and gender transformational agribusiness in Egypt and the occupied territories. On your second point of acting early, that again is absolutely crucial. We know that if you can act early, you have a profound impact on people's well-being. We're working with our own UK Met Office to get some of the data right, backing the UN's Early Warning Initiative, and we also have and I co-chair it, our Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership that is looking to bring together climate, humanitarian and development partners, and we're pleased that Somalia is on the governing board for that. Conflict sensitivity in the program is really important, trauma sensitivity too. We champion the COP28 Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace Declaration so that climate action does not pour more fuel on the fire of conflict or tension. And we launched the Common Principles for Effective Climate Finance and Action at last year's COP29 Peace Day, which underlines our commitment to integrating peace building and climate. And then on the third point, Zara, about having people at the centre, that really is vitally important to our work ahead. So we're really pleased that we were one of the first countries to endorse the LDC's principles on locally led action. I think we need to do more to bring together locally led work on humanitarian development and climate. That's another place where we need to be intentional. But the aim behind the Life AR program is to ensure that 70% of climate finance is invested behind communities' own priorities. And we're working in Burkina Faso, which has faced its own degree of fragility to do that. So in all this, we want to continue learning with and working with our partners. And thank you, I heard a number of references. We're part of a complex system. This stuff is hard. It is about really thinking about transforming systems and taking, I think, what people were saying here, an agile, responsive and person-centered approach to what we're trying to do right across the piece, And as you reminded us, aiming properly for a better world and holding those values dear to all we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody. It's very encouraging to hear that all the different initiatives that are happening, but I think one thing is clear is that there's not enough of it, right? And we need to continue our advocacy. We need to keep sharing how possible it is. We need to keep sharing what communities are thinking, and we need to also address the root cause. We need to be honest about the root causes of the crises we're in, and we need to address them, and we have to get uncomfortable, and we have to fight for a better world. It's absolutely crucial. Before we end, we have some time for questions, if anyone has any questions for any of the panelists. Okay, well, seems like we don't have any questions, so I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. It's been an absolutely excellent panel, so thank you very, very much. And yes, please keep advocating for more assistance to go where it's needed. Thank you so much.